Can I say, Morrison, you were magnificent. You gave to us on the 18th of May a really wonderful victory, a deserved victory, a victory against the predictions of many. And I, like all other Liberals and many others around Australia, were inspired by your determination, your simple capacity to communicate a passion for the future of your country. And you did it so well, and we are so grateful to have you as our Prime Minister. Tonight ought to be a mixture of nostalgia and steely determination. We are right to be proud of what was bequeathed to us by that great man, Robert Menzies. His feats will never be equalled. He led this country for 8.5 years. But more importantly than that, he laid down an approach and a philosophy of government which has left a lasting legacy that we see around us every day. I can remember when, as Treasurer in the Fraser government, I visited Washington in 1979 and I met Alan Greenspan, who was later to become the chairman of the Federal Reserve System. But at that time, he was the chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors. I'd never met him before. And he said, Mr. Howard, he said, you're from Australia, aren't you? I said, yes. He said, you've got the biggest middle class in the world. Now that was, when you think about it, an extraordinary compliment from somebody who understood what he was talking about. And what he was saying then in 1979, that we had built in this country an opportunity society, a middle class, which gave us an unparalleled capacity to give people the opportunity of improving their lives. One of the great things about the Australian achievement, and I think that's an expression we ought to use a little more frequently, I'm glad Scott used it tonight. One of the great things about the Australian achievement is our sense of balance. When I think of Australia's history, I think of the enormous debt that we owe to the British. We took wonderful things. We took the rule of law, parliamentary democracy, freedom of the press, broadly speaking, the same sense of humour. Broadly speaking, the same sense of humour. But one thing we didn't take was any pretension to class distinction or the establishment of an aristocracy. Because we knew deep down that that wouldn't work in that country of ours, and that it wasn't going to be our style. And through the decades, we have demonstrated this unrivalled capacity as a nation to strike a sense of balance. We don't have these idiotic ongoing arguments about whether health provision should be totally private or totally public. We see a mixture of the two. And it's one of the endearing qualities of the Australian nation. And one of the reasons why the Liberal Party has been successful, as Scott outlined, is that we have understood the yearning of the Australian people for a sense of balance. Australians don't like fanatics. They don't like people who are too zealous in prosecuting their point of view. They want a political party that understands the mood and the temper of the Australian people. The cornerstone of our security remains our alliance with the United States of America. We may differ and we may argue about particular policies of particular leaders, but it's an alliance that transcends whoever is in the Lodge or the White House. And it was in 1951, with Percy Spender as Minister for External Affairs and Menzies, of course, as Prime Minister, that the ANZUS Treaty was signed. But that reminds me that in 1957, Australia did a remarkable thing. Only 12 years after the end of World War II, and included in its ranks men who'd been prisoners of war of the Japanese, such as Reg Swartz, Alexander Downer's father, Alec Downer, and on the other side of politics, there was Tom Uren and others. But the Menzies government, through the great agency of John McEwen, the Minister for Trade and later Deputy Prime Minister, signed a commerce agreement with Japan. And it was signed in 1957. Now that commerce agreement took some courage. It took a capacity on the part of Bob Menzies and John McEwen and others to look to the future. And let me remind you that when ratification of the treaty came before the National Parliament, the Australian Labor Party voted against it. The party that keeps lecturing us about how they opened Australia up to the Asia-Pacific region voted against something that arguably did more to lay the foundation of our now priceless economic links with the countries of Asia, that they voted against that. It was just yet another example of how, of how very important was the foresight of the Menzies government. As we've been reminded, of course, it was under Harold Holt's Prime Ministership that the referendum was held and successfully carried by over 90% of the Australian people to recognise the right of Aboriginal Australians to be included in the census, and also to give the Commonwealth Parliament concurrent right to pass laws in relation to Aboriginal citizens. I mentioned a few moments ago the capacity of this country to have a dual approach, both public and private, to education. One of the things that perhaps many people in this room, certainly anybody under the age of probably 55, would not appreciate as much as some of the rest of us, was how deep sectarian feelings ran through Australian society until the 1960s. And one of the great things that I think Bob Menzies did for this country, not only in terms of education justice, but also providing some social balm and breaking down barriers between Catholics and Protestants, and removing close to 100 years of discrimination against the Catholic community of this country, was his decision in 1963 to inaugurate state aid for independent schools. I mention these things, my friends, to make the point that at so many stages of Australian history since the Liberal Party was formed, it has been a Liberal government. First, the Menzies government, and then the Holt government, and other governments that have broken through and turned the corner on something we now look back on and say, why on earth did it take us so long to come to that realisation? There's been more to the Liberal Party's success than economic management. It's understanding of the character and the heart of the Australian people, which has been the cornerstone of its success. As I look back on those years, I not only join all of you in honouring the genius, the intellect, the capacity and the leadership skills of Bob Menzies, but I also honour the coalition with the National Party, previously the Country Party. Deep down, we should never imagine that we are immune from hubris, that we are never going to lose an election. The prospects look good, but they looked good for the Labor Party in 2001. I can remember when we celebrated the centenary of Federation. The Labor Party had a massive dinner in Melbourne. I had Bob Hawke and Keating, everybody there, and they were really celebrating in advance their victory at the end of the year. And of course, then they ran into the reality of the Aston by-election. And with a magnificent candidate, the Victorian division held that seat when everybody knew that if normal by-election connotations had applied, it would have been lost. So politics is full of those reminders. I know how depressed many people were a year out from the last election. I know how depressed many people were when it was called. One of those people, of course, and we must be ever thankful for this, was not the Prime Minister. He always had that buoyant sense of optimism and a positive determination to do everything he could to bring about the right result. Everything that I have achieved in politics, I owe so much to the Liberal Party of Australia. I would never have been a Member of Parliament if I hadn't received Liberal Party endorsement. I would never have been successful as a minister if I had not been part of a Liberal parliamentary team. And I think it's important to remember what we owe to our collective political identity. I am greatly in debt to the Liberal Party. It was very supportive of me at times when it was entitled not to be, when it was entitled to feel let down and entitled to feel frustrated. But it gave me great loyalty and great support. And I've tried both as a serving Member of Parliament, in government, as a minister and as Prime Minister, to repay that debt and subsequently to do what I can to help our great cause. It is a great cause. As Menzies said in a speech he gave to the convention of the New South Wales Liberal Party in 1962, he best described it as a faith. He said it wasn't doctrine or dogma. He said it was a faith about the individual. And I often describe the Liberal Party as a broad church, that it contains the custodian of the classical liberal tradition and also the conservative tradition. And using different language, in this speech, our founder said the same thing. He said that when he put the party together, you had people saying, oh, so-and-so, he's too left, or so-and-so, he's too right. And he said all of a sudden we realised that there was room for all of the mansions in our political heaven. And he was drawing on a reference in the Gospel of St John, which he would later use in relation to his approach to providing assistance to independent schools. What Menzies said then, and what we should always say, is that there is room for a range of views and a range of people, provided we retain the common faith. And that common faith does not drive people out because we may not agree with them, but seeks to include them because we recognise that the things that unite us as Liberals are infinitely more important and more enduring than those that might from time to time divide us. My friends, thank you very much. Thank you very, very much indeed.
Authorised A. Hurst, Liberal Party, Canberra.